Hello AP Biology students, let's go over the 15th section in Unit 7. This is going to be our last section in this unit. This is going to be about how species are related. Remember in this part of the unit that we're talking about how species are related through certain adaptations. When tracking how species are related, we have to be careful that we look at adaptations in certain ways, because sometimes adaptations that are very similar to each other can evolve in distinctly different species. This term is known as convergent evolution. This is where there are adaptations that two organisms have evolved that are very similar to each other, but they evolved in completely different ways. For instance, how birds fly and how bats fly are very different, although they accomplish the same thing, flight. Obviously, birds evolved feathers to help them fly, while bats evolved more of a skin-like appendage to help them fly. Now, both of these adaptations help the organism fly, but they evolved in distinct lineages. They evolved differently at different time periods. To say those two adaptations make them more closely related would be false, just because, again, they evolved in separate lineages. To help us understand how species are related or how species have evolved, we can use molecular comparisons. This is looking at like DNA. Basically what we do is we look at how similar two species' DNA sequence are to each other to chart how they've evolved. The more closely related two species are, the more recent a common ancestor they have. The less of DNA they have in common, the more distant their common ancestor is. And if we look at the DNA of all life, we are all related. We just have to go back far enough to find that common ancestor. Now, obviously, organisms that we have little DNA that we have in common, that common ancestor is going to be way far back, millions to billions of years ago. But to organisms that we have a more recent ancestor, we have more DNA in common. This goes along with all species, but you can see the 4 different species that I have above here: humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. We share a lot of DNA with all 3 of the other species in this cladogram. However, there are still gaps. There are still parts of the DNA that we don't have in common. But like I said before, the more common two species DNA is, the more recent their common ancestor is. For example, like humans and chimpanzees, we have a more recent common ancestor, so more of our DNA is going to be exactly the same, or at least common. And this is because we can chart the rates of mutations, which are known as molecular clocks. This just basically looks at how often mutations occur in certain types of proteins. And when we look at different protein comparisons, we find the same thing. We can find the same changes in amino acids in a protein and show that common ancestry. So the more common a protein structure or the amino acid sequence is, the more recent a common ancestor that two species has. While the less common or the more different comparisons of their proteins, the more distant that common ancestor is. So again, these are just ways that we can chart out evolution. This is ways that we can give more quantitative analysis of how species evolve throughout time.